Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Welcome, friends. This is Dane Rome, your announcer for today's Last Days Beacon program. Thanks for listening, and thank you for joining us. And just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you would like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with Bible prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You'll find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. And thanks for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. Well, on today's program, Dr. Snitker hosts a descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier. Our guest is Paul Warren, an expert in American history and the author of our November Last Days Beacon article entitled, "How Did Jesus Christ Become Publicly Acceptable Only as a Curse?" This article deals with a disastrous Supreme Court ruling that established the separation of church and state as the law of the land. This ruling took place 70 years ago and has changed America from being the most Christian nation in the world toward becoming an anti-Christian, anti-Bible nation. I'm sure you'll find this to be a fascinating discussion. So let's listen in as Dave Snitker dialogues with Paul Warren.
It is a great joy and privilege today to have Paul Warren with us on the program today. Paul is an avid student of American history who lives in Boston, one of the most historical of all American cities. He is a descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier and hero and is the founding editor of the Boston Review of the Arts. Most importantly, Paul is a born-again believer in Jesus Christ. He loves the Lord Jesus, he loves the Word of God, and he loves the United States of America, history's great nation. Paul has written several excellent articles for Southwest Prophecy Ministries over the last couple of years. He wrote some articles for a previous ministry that I was involved with, and he has done it again. He has written an excellent article. It will be our November Last Days Beacon article. I'll show it to our listeners via camera on beautiful blue paper. It has a long title and an even longer subtitle. The title is, "How Did Jesus Christ Become Publicly Acceptable Only as a Curse?" The subtitle is, "The Giant Con That Transformed America from the Most Evangelical Nation of the Modern World to an Atheist Paradise." Well, these are weighty questions brought to us in the title and the subtitle, and we're going to discuss them on today's program. So, Paul, thank you for joining me for today's discussion.
Thank you, David.
Well, it's great to have you. You've been a great friend to the ministry, and I always find your articles to be educational, informative, and encouraging. And you've dealt with some very difficult and obscure topics over the years, and this one is no exception, and I will freely admit that I knew very little about the so-called separation of church and state decision that took place about 70 years ago by our Supreme Court. So I know this will be equally informative to our listeners as well. So we'll just jump right in, and we have some questions that we want to discuss that will lead us into the content of the article. The first one is, what is the problem with the so-called separation of church and state Supreme Court decision that was handed down to us in 1947, which by my count was about 70 years ago? What is the problem with that decision?
Well, you're right, David. It is the decision is 70 years old this year, and we are now able to see what the effect, what the fruit, as Jesus would say, of the decision has been. I should note that the decision was handed down as the largest generation in American history was being born, the baby boomers, Bill Clinton, George Bush, and Donald Trump. there's at least a half dozen problems, and I say at least. But to begin with, it violates the original intent commission of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is supposed to make decisions based on what the founding fathers meant when they wrote the Constitution and the various amendments. It reinvented America's founders from the Bible-shaped Christians that they were into Euro-socialist atheists. I believe the founders would be furiously outraged at how their words and their character have been twisted. It's a decision that is as phony as wax fruit. It is one of the most brazen cons in American history. And it is, as far as I can see, the lasting coup de grace of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal socialist campaign to reinvent America and take it into a world government, a socialist world government. It is a left-handed compliment to Christianity, and it... well, why don't we go to the next question, David?
Okay. What has been the effect of that ruling? It's been in effect for 70 years, the so-called law of the land, as the Supreme Court is the arbiter of the laws of our land, the interpretation of the Constitution or misinterpretation. As we look at the last 70 years, how has that separation of church and state decision impacted American life today?
Well, very simply, it transformed America from what it has been for 90% of its history into a European socialist atheist country where Christianity and the Bible are banned in public. It is one of the most damaging court decisions in history. If this decision is correct, then the Declaration of Independence, which is an extremely biblically shaped document, the warrant for the American Revolution, if the separation of church and state decision is correct, then the Declaration of Independence is wrong. It really is, I would say, I'm not aware of any other decision that has had as dramatic an effect on America. Essentially, it has closeted Christianity and the Bible, which were very influential in American history. I mean, for example, if you go back to the Civil War, the memorial hymn of the Civil War is the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Well, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, there was no separation of church and state there. Nobody was saying separation of church and state. The Battle Hymn of the Republic pictures the war as an apocalyptic conflict between Christ's nation and Christ's army and the army of Satan, which they meant the Confederacy. From the colonization way up into World War II and beyond, the Bible drove American history. So they realized, Roosevelt's New Deal people, that this was so powerful. Christianity and this belief in the Bible was so powerful that they could not accomplish their goal, which was to take America into a world government, to destroy America, to end America, that they had to somehow muzzle it. And, it's the decisions are just so unreasonable.
Let me play the skeptic, Paul, and say, what would you say to the person who would say that this separation of church ruling was merely an implementation of the First Amendment, which talks about the establishment of religion? What would you say to those people who equate the First Amendment with the separation ruling?
Well, up until the chaos of the World War II and the aftermath of that, there's no way that they could have gotten this through, because Americans viewed America as God's country. Many of them believed that it was the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and America was a much more faithful nation, Bible-reading nation. There's just no way, for example, in the 19th century, that this law could have gone through. I mean, for one thing, the Supreme Court in 1892 handed down a decision after a decade of study that America was, without a doubt, a Christian nation. So a few decades later, this decision comes along, the separation of church decision, and it was just a virtual denial of the 19th century Supreme Court decision. You have to understand that when the American Revolution arose, it was an impossible revolution. I mean, there were odds makers in Europe who were betting against America, taking bets against America. And the fact that America won the revolution was just an astonishing international thing. And all that's been lost. I mean, Americans are history illiterates today, not by accident, but by design, because once you know American history, it's much harder to con people into believing something like the founding fathers were atheists or humanists or socialists. And so it's not an opinion. In other words, the opinion that the founders wanted a separation of church and state. It's not an opinion that makes sense from a historical perspective.
So you're saying that this decision is different than the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment?
The Establishment Clause merely bans the establishment, the legal establishment of America as a Christian nation. That's all it does. It doesn't say anything about separating Christianity from the state. And really, when you take the long view of history, the Old Testament saints, Israel, was a theocracy. The majority of the Christian history, the Roman Catholic Church, was a theocracy. America was a union of church and state up into 1830, when Connecticut and Massachusetts stopped that union. So it's a new thing, and you have to look at the effect. It's just transformed America. We're an atheist nation today, largely to a large degree because of that decision, which was used as a weapon in the culture war.
Let me give an example. Maybe you can tell me whether this would be a result of the separation decision back in 1947. In Oklahoma, we recently had privately funded 10 Commandments placed upon the Oklahoma Capitol lawn. Again, these 10 Commandments in stone were privately funded. Not a penny of taxpayer money was appropriated for this purpose. But then there were some court challenges, and I wasn't involved with those, of course. But I heard terminology such as separation of church and state. The long and short of it is, here in Oklahoma, which is the buckle of the Bible Belt, under cover of darkness, state employees removed the 10 Commandments from the Capitol property. Would this be one of the results of the separation of church and state decision?
Well, I would call that an act of terrorism. But as we were talking earlier, David, how bizarre is it that Americans today refer to the Everson versus the Board of Education decision that came down in 1947 as the separation of church and state. The American Constitution says nothing about the separation of church and state. It merely bans the legal establishment of Christianity as the religion of the state. Soviet Union constitution.
Wow.
So Americans today, when they say the separation of church and state law, the Soviet Union is dead and buried. But this principle of the Soviet Union, this atheist principle, is enshrined in the American mind as the decision of the Supreme Court and of the Founding Fathers.
How ironic. We talk about how in the 80s that America defeated Soviet communism. Could we not say from a judicial point of view that Soviet communism defeated America?
Well, I would say from a spiritual point of view, because America is very, very different today than it was before this decision. I mean, very different. And it has been used, the decision has been used as a weapon. And, you have to remember that this whole idea of separation of church and state goes back to the French Revolution, and it's been percolating ever since then. But it has always been a European atheist idea that you just don't find in American history or even in British history that we're the descendants of Britain. You just don't find it. It's a new thing. I mean, Jefferson established some sort of a separation of church and state law when he was the governor of Virginia, when Virginia was still a colony. But that it's always come out of Europe. In other words, it's a European idea separating the church from the state that has been played around with largely the Democrat Party. You don't find the Republican Party ever using this idea.
You mentioned in your article one of the Supreme Court justices that was instrumental in the passage of this decision, this edict, a gentleman by the name of Hugo Black. Would you like to share a little bit about Hugo Black?
Well, Hugo Lafayette Black, it's funny, today, the Ku Klux Klan is a hot-button issue. Everybody is afraid of the hot-button, the Ku Klux Klan, and they're aligning Donald Trump with the Ku Klux Klan. The decision, 1947 separation of church and state decision, was written by Hugo Black, who was Hugo Lafayette Black, who was a high leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, whenever you read anything about Hugo Black and his background, they will say things like, "Well, he just joined. He was just in it for 36 months, and and yes, he was instrumental in it, but he left." Well, if you know anything about the Ku Klux Klan, you don't leave. It's a lifetime thing, and it is a secret society, so there's no way that you can, ever find evidence on these things. But clearly, he was a Ku Klux Klanner, and I read that he was a Grand Wizard, which is a really top leader. But nobody seems to know that he wrote the decision. That it's been attributed largely to him, and I don't know how Donald Trump becomes aligned with the Ku Klux Klan when the Klan has always been a Democrat institution.
Yes, I remember a long-term senator by the name of Harry Byrd, I believe from West Virginia, one of the longest running senators, and he was a high-level Ku Klux Klan member as well, and of course he was a Democrat as well. So we have Hugo Black, along with Franklin Roosevelt, perhaps the most socialistic president in America's history until our more recent president, combining their efforts to bring us this separation of church and state decision. In your article, you referred to this as one of the most bizarre of the Supreme Court edicts. Have we sufficiently covered that, or would you like to share some more of your thoughts on why you consider this to be bizarre?
Well, the first bizarre thing is the context. So in other words, it's 1947. World War II has just ended, and the Soviet Union has declared Cold War on America. And President Truman called the Soviets a clear and present danger to America. He called for funds to fight Soviet communism in America and worldwide. And he called for Americans to fight the Soviet Union. There was something called a Red Scare in the right soon after the decision, 1947 decision was handed down. America was frightened to death of the Soviet Union, and a Senate investigation found that the Franklin Roosevelt administration was packed with Soviet spies, people on the payroll of the Soviet Union. One of them, Alger Hiss, was convicted, and Hiss was one of Roosevelt's right-hand men. He did a lot of things for the Soviet Union. So, I mean, here we are. Americans are scared to death of the Soviet Union. They believe that there are Soviet agents throughout the United States. And at this point, the Supreme Court, the High Court of the land, imports from the Soviet Union one of their principal doctrines, which is that Christianity should be banned from the public square and from politics. So that's the first bizarre thing. The second one is that a Ku Klux Klan high leader, Hugo Black, wrote the decision, and much of it was from his mind, and not just the court. And then there's the third thing, that Americans began, and still do for 70 years, refer to the ruling as separation of church and state, whereas the First Amendment says nothing about separating the church from the state. It merely says you cannot legally establish in America a state church like the Church of England. So those are just three of the bizarre things, but there's really too many to go into.
Now, you also, in your article, infer that supporters of the separation of church and state ruling are paranoid. And I know that you're a gentleman and would not use that term in a loose way. Why would you call supporters of the separation of church and state edict to be paranoid?
Well, of course, you know, the Democrat Party and the media, their media, refer to anyone who believes the truth, that there are numerous conspiracies in America, paranoids. Richard Hofstadter, one of the most celebrated historians of America and American history, wrote an article in the 1960s called "The Paranoid Style in American Politics." And of course, he was referring to all those people who believed that there was, what in fact there is, a communist conspiracy in the United States. So liberals and Democrats have been throwing that term paranoid at Republicans, conservatives, evangelicals, Christians for at least a half century now. And the reason I use the word paranoid is that the law, the 1947 law, has been handled in courts in such an extreme and unreasonable way, so extreme and unreasonable, as you pointed out about the Ten Commandments thing in Oklahoma, so unreasonable and extreme that they look like they're Soviet atheists, which I think they may be. The separation law is a stealth New Deal war, a mind control war against what America has always been. when the Supreme Court in 1892 in the Trinity decision decided, after reviewing state documents and culture for 10 years, that America was indeed a Christian nation, that's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, most Christian or most American citizens on polls have declared themselves Christians. Most holidays in America are Christian. Virtually every president has declared himself a Christian. The world, especially Islam, views America as a Christian nation. If you were to say to a Muslim leader, America's not a Christian nation, he'd laugh in your face. So, is America a Christian nation? Of course it is.
Yes.
But the liberal paranoia about Christianity and America is based on the plain fact, I believe, that they're terrified of Christianity and Christian belief and the Bible. So that's the reason they've been on campaign to destroy, to restrain, or muzzle Christianity and churches and prayer closets. It scares liberal Democrats to death because they know that Christianity is the only thing that can defeat them, as it did in the Civil War. The Civil War was a war that was begun by the Democrat Party, and it was the Democrat Party going to war against America. But that's the reason for all this irrational separation in church and state laws. It's out of fright. The Democrat Party has an agenda ever since President Woodrow Wilson in 1917. They've had a world government agenda. They wanted to destroy America, to end America, and take it into a one world government. Their only obstacle is Christianity, Christians, and the Bible. And as long as Americans believe in the Bible, as long as they believe that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead and is returning, and that they will face him in judgment, they can't achieve their goal of ending America and taking it into a one-world government centered in Europe.
Could we say that this 1947 ruling represents a judicial jihad against Christianity?
Well, I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't think that's inaccurate.
We talk about Islamic jihad, and of course that takes a different form, as we saw in New York City yesterday with the mowing down of several spectators by a jihadi. But really, as I think about it, this 1947 ruling is a judicial jihad with the same purpose, and that is eliminating Christianity and eliminating Christians from the public square.
Nobody seems to remember, David, that Islam was America's first enemy. In other words, after the American Revolution was won, and when Jefferson took office in 1801, they declared jihad against America, and today it's known as the Barbary War. But Islam has always hated Christianity and hated America. And Islam talks about jihad as a holy war, but many liberal spokesmen for Islam will say, well, jihad it's a concept, and so you can commit or you can do jihad by, for example, wearing a headscarf. It's my belief, and maybe I'm wrong, that the Muslims who have come over to America are outwardly peaceful, but last night I was in a supermarket and there were 3 Muslim women there with headscarves. Now this is just a few hours after what happened in New York. And they were making a lot of commotion, laughing and joking and shouting. And I thought, how strange that they would be. You would think that, they would be very quiet, kind of ashamed of what happened, but they seemed like they were in a celebratory mood. And I believe that the peaceful Muslims that are here, they hate America, they hate Christianity, so why are they here? They're here on a quiet jihad. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally in other words, jihad can be an attitude as well as overt behavior, which, of course, at some point could lead to overt behavior. There are some who are much more knowledgeable of these things who are saying that the so-called peaceful Muslims in this country are preparing for what they call a Tet offensive, which, of course, those who are familiar with the Vietnamese War was when the North Vietnamese infiltrated South Vietnam and at a particular point in time created an offensive where they all became active at once and were able to subdue South Vietnam in that manner.
David, it's so sad that the Christian church in America today is so weak and so disrespected, because it used to be America would have to send missionaries over to the Middle East on missions to help Muslims see the light and come out of the darkness.
Yes.
But one of the saddest things, and I think it's why the separation of church and state law, this tyranny, has been so successful, because the evangelical church, evangelical leaders have become so liberalized, and they've just watered down and weakened Christianity to the point where it makes it difficult to really show Muslims the truth of Jesus Christ. I mean, that would be the great thing, is if Muslims could come over here and see this shining example of what Christianity is and be converted.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, instead we have liberal Christian leaders who are involved in interfaith dialogue with Muslims, basically apologists for the peaceful Muslim faith. And I attended one such meeting and I didn't participate, but I observed liberal Christian leaders, pastors, etc., involved in what's called interfaith dialogue with Muslim leaders, and basically become apologists for this so-called peaceful religion of Islam, which again is a testimony to the weakness and apostasy of Christianity in America. So we're looking at jihad, and really it points to me to the larger war between God and the devil. And of course, that war has many aspects, and I think we're both in agreement that the separation of church and state decision in 1947 was one aspect, a judicial aspect of the assault of the world, the assault against Satan and his bands, against history's great nation, the one nation that was founded as a Christian nation, which has pretty well driven the church into a state of silence and pietism. Would that be too strong a statement?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, during the Crusades, Islam would use Muslim jihadists would use weapons to defeat their enemies, but they also learned very quickly the power of propaganda. And the separation of church and state decision, in my mind, and maybe I'm wrong, is a stealth weapon that has been extremely effective in silencing Christians. The Christian Coalition declared in 1995 that America is not a Christian nation, and that the separation of church and state decision is an authentic one. And I just wonder if you have leaders like that, what is the state of Christianity?
Absolutely, and that was 22 years ago when that acknowledgement or that treasonous position was espoused. Well, the separation of church and state has certainly had a tremendous impact upon our world. As we look at the news from day to day, each step in the retreat of Christianity from the public square is often justified by this landmark decision. And so I think that's why I think this is such an important decision and an important article. And just to tease our listeners, you will be writing a December article along the same line. Tell us what the topic is. We'll be doing another interview with you after that article is published.
Well, David, the silence of evangelical leaders in the aftermath of this decision is eerie. If you go to the internet or the library to find the evangelical response to this decision, there's very little there. And evangelical leaders began not long after the decision was handed down. And by the way, the decision came in 1947. Within months, the tip of the spear of the decision was in the classroom. As baby boomers were being born, prayer was banned in schools. But the evangelical leaders began using the words of Jesus, essentially a ruling by Jesus, to sanctify this phony decision. And the fact is, the piece of scripture that they used, the give to Caesar pericope, had nothing to do with the church. Jesus was not laying down church doctrine, but he did tell Christians what they should do by the name that he gave to the church. And so we'll look at that next month.
I'm looking forward to it. Well, Paul, this has been a fascinating discussion. I can see by the clock on the wall we're about out of time for today, and I thank you for joining me today, and especially thank you for writing this informative article.
Well, thank you, David.
Yes, we'll look forward to resuming our conversation next month as we talk about the December Last Days Beacon. Well, friends, each month our ministry publishes articles dealing with Bible prophecy or current issues. We would love to add you to our mailing list. When you purchase materials from our ministry, you are automatically added to our mailing list. And so now our announcer, Dane Rome, will share how you may obtain copies of the November Last Days Beacon by our guest, Paul Warren.
Thank you, Dr. Schnichter. Friends, you may obtain 5 copies of the November Last Days Beacon for a gift of $5. Simply go to the homepage of our website, www.swpm.us. That website address again is www.swpm.us. Click on the bookstore link and type November Last Days Beacon. Again, you may order 5 copies for a gift of $5. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Well, please join us next week for another Last Days Beacon program brought to you by the Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Until then, this is Dane Rome saying thanks for listening.